Hi, in this video I would like to share with you the top 5 best opening traps in Sicilian Defense. And why are we talking about Sicilian Defense particularly? It's because it is the most common chess opening. The majority of the chess games are started with pawn to e4, and the most popular reply for black by far is pawn to c5, known as Sicilian Defense. And therefore definitely does make sense for you to invest a little bit of your time to learn to play Sicilian Defense well. And in this video you'll learn 5 very practical chess traps that you can apply immediately after watching this video. And we'll start with one of my favorite ones, which happens in the knight variation of Sicilian Defense. After these first moves, pawn takes, knight f6. Knight variation is the most popular line in Sicilian, popularized by Fischer and later on by Kasparov. Two of them are arguably best players of all times, so a lot of players follow their footsteps and play in this knight variation. And here the main move for white, at least it used to be for a long time, was bishop to g5. Black replies with pawn to e6. White continues with pawn to f4. We're still going over the main line, or at least one of the main lines. And the main reply for black here is knight to d7. At least in the recent years, black usually prefer this move. And here there is a very interesting thing to play. The main move for white here is queen to f3, which just goes into the main theoretical variation. However, instead you can play a little bit of a tricky, even though very natural looking move, bishop to c4. And what I really love about this is that, white does not make anything artificial or anything weird. You're just developing pieces normally, and at the same time you're setting a very nice and natural trap. At this point it seems to be very natural for black and very tempting to push the pawn to b5. And even your move with the bishop to c4 kind of provokes black to kick it off with the pawn, and that's what he may wish to do here. Anyway, that's the b5 advancement is one of the very typical things for black to do, so it's very common for him to play this move. And at this point, all of a sudden, white can sacrifice a bishop with bishop takes e6. Black should probably recapture. White recaptures with the knight. And at this point, white is attacking black's queen on d8 with his knight. At the same time, pay attention to the fact that the queen has to cover the c7 square, because otherwise white's knight will jump there with a double attack over black's king and also the rook on a8, which would be certainly unpleasant for black. And therefore, the choice for black is not that huge. He'll probably play queen to b6, so that the queen goes away from the attack and also it keeps looking at that c7 square. And at this point, it seems to be unclear why white sacrificed the bishop, because it looks like everything is just fine with black and there is no easy continuation of the white's attack. However, let's continue. Here white has a very powerful continuation. Knight goes to d5. Once again, white is attacking black's queen with the knight, and once again white reinforces that threat of knight going to c7. One of the white's knights may go there in the next move, and therefore black is pretty much forced to take the knight. White recaptures with a queen. It not only gets back the knight, but also attacks that rook on a8, and therefore black definitely needs to address this threat somehow. Let me mention here that if black tries to check the white's king with queen to e3 check, there is no real danger for white here at all, because white just goes away with the king, and you may easily notice that there is no continuation for the black's potential attack, because the lonely queen cannot cause any real threats for white. And white can easily kick it away anytime with rook to e1, for instance, on the next turn or anytime. So let's go back. It was not really efficient for black. And instead, since once again, let me remind you that the rook on a8 is hanging and black needs to do something about it, it looks very natural for black to reply with bishop to b7, not only covering the rook, but also attacking the white's queen. And at this point, white has a very powerful continuation, and let me give you a couple seconds to think about it. So please think, what should white play here? While you're thinking, let me make a quick note. I realize that I go through the lines relatively quickly, just because I really want to share with you a couple of the great opening traps within this relatively short video, and that's why I have to go through the lines quite quickly. But anyway, after watching this video, you'll be able to download the file, the PGN file with these variations, and go over them once again. And I think you can also choose another speed of this video on YouTube, and you can choose 0.5 speed. So I'll be speaking 2 times slower for the rest of my life. Anyway, I hope you noticed the right continuation. It is knight going to c7, which is check, and the only thing black can do is to capture the knight, but then that sacrificed enabled white to go with queen e6, and this is checkmate on the next move. So the only thing black can do is bishop e7, and this is checkmate. Really great opening trap with all the most natural moves for white and black, and at the same time it is the trap in one of the main lines of the Sicilian knight operation, which is one of the main chess openings of all. And now we're moving on to the second trap. I got a lot of them for you, but for this video I've selected the top 5, because really over the last few months I've been digging into the Sicilian Defense quite extensively, because we've been working on a new course about Sicilian Defense, so I got a lot of information. But for this video about opening traps, I have selected those traps that has the highest chances to happen in your practical games. So that's something that you can really apply. Alright, let's go into the next trap. It happens after these first moves. It might be called Accelerated Dragon, or I'm not even sure what's the proper title for this opening, but at this point it happens if black decides to choose these first moves and then continue with pawn to g6. It seems to be just one way to get into dragon type of positions, and well, also one of the typical things for black to do in Sicilian Defense. However, if black chooses these inaccurate order of moves, white has the powerful continuation, which starts from knight takes c6 to eliminate that knight, which is a defender of that key e5 square, and after black recaptures, white can push the pawn to e5, and that causes some troubles for black as he has to move the knight away, and there is no convenient square. Of course, black can move the knight on the edge, somewhere on g8 or h5, but those are just passive squares to move the knight to, and it's not what black wants to play. Otherwise, the only thing black can really do is try to sacrifice a pawn for activity. In that case, black can go with the knight in the center, knight to d5. And therefore, while continue with knight takes, queen takes, taking the rook on a8. Yeah, we have, by the way, seen the similar motif in the previous trap. Black goes rook to b8, and at this point everything looks pretty cool for black. He sacrificed the pawn but gained a little bit of activity. His rook became active on the b file. He's ready to play bishop b7 on the next move. So it seems like he has some compensation. But white has very unusual tactics here. It's the move pawn to e6. And the reason for playing pawn to e6 is if black captures the pawn with either of his pawns, and it's hard for black to ignore the white's threat, because white is gonna capture pawn on f7, it's gonna be checkmate. And if black captures the pawn, white continues with queen to e5 with the very unusual tactics of a double attack of black's rooks. And all of a sudden there is no way for black to get away of these folk. Therefore black will lose one of the rooks, and he can safely resign at this point. Let's move on to the third trap. Of course, we're still talking about the Sicilian Defense, which is the theme of this video. And now let's talk about the right sequence of moves for black. If black wants to play the classical dragon variation with pawn to g6 at this point, white can still insist in realizing the same idea that we have just seen in the previous example. White can play pawn to f4, preparing that advancement with a pawn to e5. And even though it's quite a well-known variation called live-and-fish variation, black still falls into this trap quite regularly. The thing is, on the previous move, black just played pawn to g6, and he intended to put his bishop on g7, and it is very natural to do just that. However, at this point, it's rather a mistake, because it allows white to push the pawn to e5, and similarly with the previous example, it causes some troubles to the black's knight on f6 because it's quite unclear where to move this knight. One of the ways for black is to move the knight to g4, and by the way, wherever black moves the knight, there's going to be some troubles, because the pawn is not only attacking the knight, it is also ready to be pushed to e6 at some point. In some variations it's also unpleasant for black, and therefore let's just analyze the move knight to g4, and below the video you'll find the PGN with a short analysis of the other options for black, and in all of those options white has the strong attack. If black tries with knight to g4, trying to simply capture that pawn on the next move with his knight, white continues with bishop to b5 check, and all of a sudden this very common move bishop b5 causes significant troubles for black, because the most natural reaction would be bishop to d7, but in this case it does not work because white can simply capture the knight on g4, and you may notice that the bishop is pinned, and therefore white simply wins the whole piece for nothing. Therefore it is not the option for black. Let's take a step back. Therefore the only thing black is left with is just going king to f8. Of course, you can already see that it's pretty bad for black to leave his king in the center, but on the top of that, white has a deadly tactics here. Can you spot it? I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. White can win the game right away, and it is a move knight e6 check. It's not really a sacrifice of the knight because it's a discovered attack of black's queen on d8, and therefore in the next move black captures the knight and just queen takes d8 and it's over. We have just analyzed a couple of traps for white side, and now let's see what you can do if you're playing black. Here, after the white's main move knight to f3, there is also one unusual line, and it's surprisingly effective. It is move pawn to a6, which looks totally weird, ridiculous, and nevertheless it does make some sense. Let's see what happens next. White continues with pawn to d4, and after that black goes knight to f6, and that's already the first trap. Here if white pushes the pawn to e5, which was so unpleasant for black in all the previous examples, in this case it would be a mistake for white, because black can play queen e5 with a double attack. It is check on the white's king and also attacks over that pawn on e5, which will be captured on the next move, and therefore, of course, white just loses a pawn here. So let's take a step back. Instead of pawn to e5, white will probably go knight c3, the very common move in Sicilian defense, and here black can continue with pushing the pawn to e5 himself. At this point you can realize why it was critical for black to play a6 earlier, because now the white's knight cannot go forward onto b5, and therefore in the majority of my games at least white played knight to b3. It's not the best move probably, but anyway they played. Here you may continue with bishop to b4, so you continue playing aggressively, you impose a pin on that knight, which at the same time creates a threat of knight taking the pawn on e4. Therefore white needs to protect that pawn somehow. Let's say he plays bishop to d3, and now you can make that central advancement of pawn to d5, which is a very good advancement for black. You're fighting for the center, and actually after that exchange you are gaining control in the center, because now you are the only one who has the pawn there. Also you're double attacking the knight on c3, so let's say white will do something to protect it, and then, well, you don't win the game right away. You can probably just trade off the knights there on c3 to double the white's pawns, and then you go back with the bishop, and from here on you'll have a normal chess game. But the good thing for you is that you gained some advantage. You removed the white's pawn from the center, you doubled white's pawns here on the queen side, and all in all you're just having a very, very comfortable game. So it's not totally winning, but it's a very good game for black. Here comes the final trap for this video, and it's one of my favorite ones because my opponents fell into it so often. These are the first moves of the Polson variation of Sicilian Defense, which I used to play a lot. Here white's main move is knight to c3, black continues with queen to c7, and at this moment a lot of players, at least in Blitz games, at least club level players, play bishop to e3. just because it is one of the main setups for white in various variations of Sicilian defense. Against knight Earth, against dragon, white plays bishop e3, then usually pawn to f3, queen d2, and oftentimes the castle alongside, and in the future continues with a kingside attack, pushing his pawns there, pawn to g4 and stuff like that. And since this setup can be used against various systems of black, oftentimes white tries to play it against Paulsen variation. However, in this case, it is just a terrible choice for white. Black can play bishop b4, hitting the knight on c3, which is now double attacked with the bishop and the queen. And you can see the problem with playing bishop to e3. Earlier, while the bishop was still standing on c1, white could easily play bishop to d2 to protect the knight. But now it would seem somewhat illogical for white to move the bishop backward to d2, and therefore white will likely continue with queen to d2, which was part of his plan anyway. Here he can play knight to f6, attacking this pawn on e4 because of the pin over the knight. And by the way, this is one of the things that white can easily overlook. For instance, if he tries to play in something like pawn to a3 to kick away your bishop, you can already just grab that pawn and you're winning the game right away, because you're attacking the queen, you're attacking the knight, and because of this pin over the knight, everything is quite bad for white. Alright, let me go back. I've drawn a lot of arrows, hero, so let me clean this. Here, white will probably play pawn to f3 to protect his e4 pawn. He can also play bishop to d3, but it doesn't really matter. You continue with pawn to d5. This central advancement already gives you some initiative in the center. You're attacking this e4 pawn once again, and white has to do something about it. Here, if white captures on d5, you just recapture with the knight, and once again you renew the threat of taking on c3, because you're attacking it with the knight, bishop, and queen. The only reasonable way to protect it is to play knight to e2, which is quite a passive retreat, and you can just grab the white's bishop, getting two bishops advantage. And even though you're not winning the game right away, but again you're just getting a very comfortable game. With two bishops, you forced white's knight to go back in a passive position, and everything is just great for you. Alright, let's take a few moves back and see what else could happen here. After black played with pawn to d5, in my Blitz games, in majority of the cases, white replied with bishop to d3, which seems like a normal development move. And here black has a sudden winning continuation, which is pawn to e5. Attacking the knight, and once the knight goes away anywhere, you continue with pawn to d4 with a double attack over that bishop and over that pinned knight. You win one of the white's pieces, and therefore you get the decisive material advantage. I won a number of games with exactly this way, so I'm sure that you can too win a number of games just following these first moves of this opening trap. And at the same time, let me make one general note. I never recommend that you rely on traps alone, because let's just go into the very beginning of this variation, where black just played queen to c7. We analyzed that if white plays bishop e3, black can continue with bishop b4 and white is in trouble. But what if white plays any other move? And there are plenty of the options for white here, right? If white plays anything else, and the only thing you know is a trap, then you'll obviously be in a big trouble. So I never recommend just relying on traps alone, because the trap may work for you in 1 game out of 10. But in the rest 9 games, you need to understand the opening properly, so that whatever your opponent plays, you know how to react. So if you really wish to master the Sicilian defense, we have just finalized the course called Master Sicilian Pawn Structures, where we cover the 9 main setups of Sicilian defense, and if you study this, you'll be really have the all-round knowledge about Sicilian defense, whether you wish to play it for white or black. So if that's in your plans to master the Sicilian defense, you can just get to the link on the screen or below the video, and you can get this course with massive discounts in honor of the launch of the course. Or otherwise, if that's not in your plans, you can just download the PGN file with the traps shown in this video I hope they'll help you to win a number of games, and I'll talk to you in the next videos. Cheers, bye!